All right. Good afternoon. Welcome, Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, distinguished guests and delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name's Simon Watmo, and I'll be the moderator of our events today. We begin with opening remarks from Sir Graham Watson, who is the president of the ECPS. So without further ado, over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Simon. Excellency, Ambassador of Ukraine, and members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I'm currently in Pune, in India, teaching European politics to postgraduate students here. And I can tell you it's not easy in a place where bandwidth and connectivity are unreliable, and there's a lot of background noise. So please bear with me if the line goes down. But in my capacity as the chairman of the advisory board of ECPS, I'm pleased to share with you a few introductory thoughts for today's conference. 24th of February 2022 will go down in mythology as the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. It's easy to forget that Russia first invaded Crimea and Sebastopol 10 years earlier. Lives were lost for 8 years before the second invasion and before Europe mustered the collective courage to act decisively. Back then, military control was established, a sham referendum was held to legitimize the invasion. People who resisted or sought to preserve Ukrainian culture were persecuted, detained, had their language suppressed, and international law was repeatedly violated. Europe failed to heed the warnings of a determined Russian expansionism, despite the lessons of Georgia some years earlier. What happened a year ago was the direct result of that failure back then. Because, as our Baltic and Polish friends have been telling us for many years, Putin is dangerous and he must be stopped. You know, the Helsinki model of talking and trading with Russia brought many benefits, including a contribution to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But under Putin, it can never work, any more than Neville Chamberlain could hope to negotiate with Hitler in Munich in 1938. Much of the skill of politics lies in judgment of people, and Western Europe got Vladimir Putin quite wrong. Even when the danger became crystal clear last year, Germany and France still refused to admit it at first. I'm not generally enamored of the United Kingdom's government or its foreign policy, but I am proud that my country decided very early on we had to help Ukraine to defend itself. And I'm pleased that Olaf Scholz eventually recognized that times have changed and brought about his Zeitenwende, and that our French friend Emmanuel Macron came on side to see the invasion as an existential challenge to liberal democracy. But as so often, we have to thank President Biden and our American friends for helping us to resolve a problem in our own backyard. It is time that Europe took more responsibility for itself. Above all, we must recognize that the homes and the families destroyed in Mykolaiv or Kherson or other flattened towns are the consequence of a deliberate decision by a despot in the Kremlin. He must be held accountable for his crimes against humanity. I congratulate the European Centre for Populism Studies for preparing an excellent report on how Russian populism has affected political debate in so many European countries, and for bringing us together at this conference to discuss it. This work deserves much greater recognition. It is populist nationalism which has been mobilized to allow the butchery in Bakhmut to happen. It is populist nationalism which in recent years has rattled the foundations of the United States of America and is still threatening the European Union. And if we're going to tackle it, then we must study and understand it, which is why the work of ECPS is vital. The only antidote to populist nationalism is liberal democracy. It must prevail. It must be established from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Arctic to the Arabian Sea. I started by talking of Russia's invasion of Crimea in February of 2014. A few months after that event, a member of Lithuania's parliament, the Seimas, was elected to the European Parliament. I had known Petras Auštrevičius as one of the founders of his country's liberal movement, as an advisor to his prime minister on foreign affairs, and as one of the chief negotiators of Lithuania's entry to the European Union. Petras is a formidable campaigner for human rights and for liberal democracy across Europe and beyond. He has been a powerful voice in Europe for liberalism, as a member of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, as a member of its Human Rights Subcommittee, as a member of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in Democratic Processes, and as chairman of the Delegation for Relations with Afghanistan and reporter on Belarus. We in the ECPS are very pleased to have secured such a prominent and eminent person as the keynote speaker at today's conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a big hand of welcome to Petras Auštrevičius, MEP. Petras, over to you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you for your overwhelming introduction. Indeed, it's my pleasure to be with you and to be colleagues in the European Parliament. I appreciate every cooperation and all projects we have been involved by now and today. And I thank you, the European Centre for Populism Studies, making a decision, to come to the European Parliament was most welcome. I understood that for some, or probably many of you, it's very first time to be in the European Parliament, but enjoy your stay. It's your house as well. It's your house of representation, and so here we work and here we make decisions which impact our lives in now and in future. Indeed, Graham rightly mentioned, I was elected to the European Parliament in 2014. That was May 2014. But events in Ukraine have started in December 13, some 6 months before. And I happened to be 6 times in Maidan as a still member of the Lithuanian Parliament, and then continued having the credentials of the European Parliament. But it started, it colored my career much, the events in Ukraine. And up to now, I'm really busy with Ukraine, and rightly so, and I believe it will bring some good resolution in a close future. I am a strong believer in Ukraine's victory. Ladies and gentlemen, back in January 2020, I really thought that Brexit will be only upheaval for this legislature, for legislature 2019-24. But in February 22, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has set up absolutely new geopolitical reality, not just in Europe, but on a global scale. So we are living through the most revisionist and most momentous geopolitical event of the 21st century. Today, at the 377th day of the war of aggression, the war in Ukraine is set to intensify in the coming months. Putin's determination not to lose suggests he is likely to continue to press for further territorial gains and consolidation. Kremlin continues its criminal war and shows no signs of political change. This is matched by Ukraine's legitimate determination to recover lost territory and restore its full territorial integrity as it deploys better arms and Western equipment from Western allies on the battlefield. The duration of the war and its outcome are indeterminate at this point. We strongly believe in Ukraine's victory, and so do our utmost to help it with the humanitarian, financial, and military assistance. It's clear that Ukraine became the testing point of Western security system and our resilience against any aggressor. Overcoming the first shock and waking up in front of a new geopolitical reality, the West, and the European Union in particular, came up with the unseen-before sanctions policy, although gradual and not comprehensive in the beginning, and major assistance package for Ukraine. Following months of war, the West came out more united and more unified than ever, confirming credentials of the North Atlantic Treaty and expanding into 2 more states. I hope successfully Finland and Sweden will become full member states of the NATO. We've been able to resolve major situation with energy as Russian attempt to weaponize this strategic resource has failed. And the Green Deal will constrain resources and finances of the Russian Federation to the unseen levels. A coalition of nations from the Atlantic to Pacific were more unified and stand guard over democratic values, freedom, and human respect. I must say that democratic community of the world has increased and strengthened. In the course of the last year, we have understood the gravity of Russian war of aggression as an attempt to challenge the West and Europe in particular. Europe hopefully understood that dealing with Putin was a mouse trap, leading to energy dependency, corruption of elites, and increasing political interference into our domestic politics. Finally, in European capitals, we realized that there is no common future with Putin's Russia, and Europe must take immediate steps strengthening own defense and resilience. And here we come to the point which for decades Europe was in a military capacities decline on one hand and dangerously exposed to hybrid threats from increasingly imperialistic Russia. The last decades, Russian-led state propaganda and disinformation, political interference, and collaboration with certain political forces become more visible, powerful, and I have to admit, effective. Russian penetration into our societies, politics, and public life in general become a kind of a new standard, which was denied by some and neglected by many for too long. Russian state propaganda acting and pretending to look as independent media spread false and dangerous narratives in the environment which was not really critical and probably too acceptive. Kremlin developed a whole system of relations with political parties in Europe and worldwide, extending its with the parties on the right, in the center, and on the left as well. Ideology-based cooperation with some and finance with others become a common course of the Russian politics. West made decisive commitment to support Ukraine, and we become strong allies with the country, especially after February 24 last year. But we still face quite a mess on political side of our societies, once Russian penetration remains highly risky and still expanding. That's why let me to welcome a very comprehensive study by the European Center for Populism Studies, and I'm personally looking forward for our debate as an important step in order to strengthen our resilience and to disclose some facts which must be clear and available to a large public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petros, for your welcome remarks and for your gracious hosting of us here today at the European Parliament. The ECPS is honoured today to welcome to the symposium His Excellency Ambassador Vsevolod, head of the mission of Ukraine to the European Union. And I would like to pass over to the Ambassador for some remarks.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank, first of all, the European Center for Populism Studies and European Parliament, and personally Petros Austrevicius for hosting this event. I think it's very timely, and indeed this comprehensive report it's a good basis for this discussion and also for the follow-up action. I wanted also to thank Mr. Graham Watson for his input, and I remember his continuous support when he was a leader of the ALDE group then. Now it is bigger, and we know the group as a Renew group, but he is a strong friend of Ukraine, and many thanks for being with us today. You already, both Mr. Watson and you, Petros, already mentioned many things that I wanted to build up my statement, but I want to emphasize that whatever Putin and his regime is trying to do in Ukraine, in waging full-fledged aggression or against Europe, the result is opposite. So what they achieved so far is unified, strong Ukrainian society, fighting and working together with the government, with Ukrainian armed forces. So the nation is united as never before. They achieved the united European Union, adopting already 10th package of sanctions. The work is going on the next packages. The overwhelming support of Ukraine also on the public level, and I think that was the most important element, especially in the beginning of the war, and the factor which helped all of us to get in our relations with the Union where we are, getting membership perspective, getting this level of financial support. And you know that only for this year, European Union has allocated or earmarked 18 billion, and the overall support during the last year, EU combined with the member states, about 50 billion already. Also, it helped to unify, to build up the stronger transatlantic unity. So whether it's a sanction package or efforts on the future reconstruction or financial support, it's always G7 plus EU working together. And this unity is there. So you mentioned NATO, so there is a new spirit of partnership and unity in the alliance as well. And you have, you remember how this discussion, this Putin brinkmanship started. He offered NATO to track back to the situation of early 90s. He achieved the opposite, so that now two new member states will join the alliance. You have stronger presence in Europe of the alliance, and so forth and so forth, so on. We are building up our relations with not only with the EU but also with NATO in a progressive and a strong way. I also wanted to use this opportunity to thank in particular European Parliament for its role in boosting this agenda, Ukraine support, and European Parliament was the first among the institutions to call openly and strongly for the membership perspective of Ukraine and of Ukraine, strong sanctions, strong measures against Russia. And if you have a look, take a look into the recently adopted resolution of 16 February this year, devoted to 1 year resistance of Ukraine against Russian invasion. You have the clear call for the fastest possible delivery of weapons we need, also for the stronger international isolation of Russian Federation, including in the matters of its membership in the international organizations, including UN Security Council, very strong step and decisive. And personally, you, Petros, for your contribution to this resolution, and as far as I know, that was your personal idea to focus also on a sacred thing for the Russian presence, for the Russian whole construction, political construction, which is membership, permanent membership in the UN. We need to address those issues, especially taking into account that Russia has been cheating its partners, not during the last year, but during the last 30 years. So we need to be vigilant, we need to be brave, pushing Russia out of international fora. Regarding the topic of today's event, definitely this discussion in the European Parliament and other bodies, they're quite focused on the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But this is much broader. So this aggression outside this foreign aggression for Russia, it's just one of the features of the totalitarian regime, which oppress people inside and wage war outside to reinforce this fake idea of the siege fortress, trying to unite people around fictitious argument that Russia is under attack, Russian society is under threat, and you can read it and hear it in each and every statement of Putin himself and of representatives of his regime. And one of the strongest tools of this regime, in the toolkit of Russian regime, is propaganda and disinformation. Now, Russian society is a Orwellian society. If you read 1984, so this is a modern Russia with a totalitarian, oppressive powers and excessive powers of Russian law enforcement, of Russian special services, of controlling agencies like Roskomnadzor, Big Brother. So very distinctive features of not just a totalitarian regime, but a kind of a new type of a fascist society, where the population is on one hand politically immobilized because they do not influence the political life in the country. On the other hand, working together with the regime and enjoying its moral degradation. So you can see those who watch, and some of you have to do it professionally, to read what Russian media produce, or to watch. You see almost this physical pleasure of insulting not only Ukraine and Ukrainians, but the whole world, in particular Europe and its institutions. So, and by the way, in 1984, now it's prohibited in Russia. So it's taken out from the shops and libraries, and you can wonder why. So the regime is on one hand very aggressive, on the other hand it's on defensive. And we should not be shy, we should be brave, because we are stronger, we are bigger. If we compare the output of the economies of the member states and the Western world and Russian Federation, Ukrainian army, not mentioning NATO armies, is strong enough to keep Russia and to defend itself, and we are gearing up for the counteroffensive, and we definitely count on the weapons and ammunition and support in providing Ukraine with ammunition. We already mentioned this. So we are capable of defending ourselves. And once again, I'm talking not only about Ukraine. We are on the forefront, but defending Europe, defending civilized world. Last but not least, and it's not the war between West and East as Russia want to portray it. We are reaching out to the global South, and the level of support of Ukraine in the UN General Assembly is 140 plus. You have a very narrow camp of Russia supporters. You know those countries, and you can count them basically on one hand now. Yes, there are many countries which still abstain because they have a special dependency or special relations or history of relations with Russia, and we need to work on those issues, and we need to deprive Russia of those instruments of influence, be it agricultural dependence of Russian food or fertilizers or equipment or weapons, whatever. And we need to work not only on the government-to-government level, but to engage civil society, to engage opinion shapers in those countries, in Latin America, in Africa, and to reach out to people and explain that it's about killing innocent people under the fake pretext, historical fantasies, phantom pains of the empire, which is on its final critical stage, and it must die, this empire. And we are living in the historical moment, and it depends on us how strong we are and how resilient we are to achieve this goal, to defend ourselves, and by the way, at the end of the day, to help Russian people, which are under occupation now by this criminal regime. Thank you again for the invitation, and looking forward to interesting productive discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for your remarks and reminding us of the importance of courage, the courage of the Ukrainian people against this brutal aggression and the courage we need to remember as we stand with Ukraine. So that brings us to the report itself. On Monday, the ECPS was delighted to publish the report on the impact of the war in Ukraine on right-wing populism in Europe. And the report was brought together 30 scholars covering 24 member states and candidate states of the European Union, and our terrific report editors, Dr. Emilia Zankina and Dr. Gilles Ivadi, they brought the report together in record time, and it's fantastic. So I'm going to pass over to them, and they'll present the main findings of the report for us.
Okay, thank you, Simon, for the kind introduction, Mr. Ambassador, members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. If I may speak for Emilia and myself, we are very pleased to be here today to present this report. It's been a great undertaking. As Simon said, we did that within a few months with the help of both the ECPS team, which has been extremely efficient. So thank you, Aziz, Ivan, Martin, Simon. And of course, with the help of all the scholars, experts in all the countries that we've been surveying for this report. So I think we are very pleased to see nearly all of you here today to share this, this presentation. What we want to do here briefly is to maybe give you a few key findings, some conclusions that we got from the report. As you may have seen already, it's quite a big report. It's nearly 400 pages covering many countries, as Simon said. So there are lots of information, facts, and so we just want to provide maybe some key conclusions. As you may have seen, the title of the report is "The Impacts" with an S at the end, the plural form, and I think it reflects the fact that the war that we've been witnessing for over a year now has had many implications, many repercussions in our countries for populations, of course, for people in Ukraine first, of course, but also national politics. And the war has been affecting national politics throughout Europe. And this report wanted to look at the multiple issues, economic issues, cultural issues, migration issues, political issues that have been, produced by the war. And what we've seen is that even in preparing the report, we knew there would be a lot of diversity, a lot of heterogeneity in whatever the findings we would get from all the country experts, because we could see that the situations were so different, the contexts were so different. So what we wanted to do was to focus on one specific party family, which is the right-wing populist party family in Europe. And the reason for that, of course, is that this, at the moment, unfortunately, is one of the most successful political families in Europe, as recent elections have shown. It's also because those parties, they are the principal agents of illiberal politics in many countries. They are nativist, they are authoritarian, they go against many of the values and core ideas of this institution, of Europe, and of liberal democracy at large. So, of course, these parties, they represent a specific threat to liberal democracy. But maybe the main reason was, of course, that many of those parties, they are well-known admirers of Russia and Vladimir Putin. And as we've been told, they've had, many of those parties, they have had formal links with Russia, either funding or ideological relationships or meeting with Russian representatives. So we thought that that one party family should be the focus of the report for all those reasons.
Can I just get you to change microphones?
Okay. So basically what we asked our country experts to do was to answer two main questions. The first one was, what was, so to speak, the topography of far-right or right-wing populism in your country? And how would you describe the links of those parties with Russia before the war? We wanted to know what was going on before the war. And then, of course, the second question was, how did those parties respond to the war? Because, of course, after the invasion of Ukraine, those parties have been put under a lot of strain in their respective political systems. They had to deal with accusation of sympathy for Putin and therefore their previous support. If I take France, for instance, the Rassemblement National had to even justify its previous financial links with the Kremlin. So altogether, those parties, they had to address new issues, this new context produced by the war. And we wanted to ask our experts what was going on in their respective countries. How did those parties navigate the war? What sort of arguments, rhetoric, strategies those parties would pursue, use just after the invasion? Would they shift their positions? Would they change their policies? How would they evade accusations of sympathy for Putin? All those questions were in the report. And this, of course, concerned essentially what we could call the supply side of right-wing populist politics of the war. But we were also interested in the demand side, because when I said that the war was affecting European politics, we wanted to know also how the war may have affected the popularity, the electoral support for those parties in their countries. We wanted to know because we've all read pieces here and there, heralding or announcing the end of populism because of war. And in fact, recent elections sort of disproved this or suggested that those parties may be even more successful despite the war. So we wanted to have an overview as comprehensive as possible of what has happened to those parties, either in elections that took place just after the war, or just in terms of popularity, support, to see whether those parties were losing ground because of the war. And these were the main questions. There were other questions, of course, but I can't summarize everything here. And these were the main questions. Maybe I can hand it over to Emilia to share some of the findings that we've tried to put together in the conclusion based on those many different country chapters and very in-depth and excellent analysis of what was going on in every country covered by the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles, for this wonderful collaboration, and a huge thank to all the authors who delivered these papers in such a short time and found time in their tight schedule. We have a wonderful mix of experts. We looked for the very best in each country, so we're very proud. Thank you, Your Excellency, and members of the European Parliament, and to all the guests for being here. This has been a wonderful collaboration, and the credit, I believe, goes first and foremost to ECPS, Aziza, Martin, Ivan, for keeping us in line and disciplined, and for facilitating and helping us in every way. The findings of the report were extremely interesting. As a scholar of East European politics, I personally expected that we would see a very clear East-West divide in the findings. But what we find instead is that this diversity or heterogeneity is prevalent at every level. So on the one hand, you have differences across countries, but you also have differences within countries, within the radical right populist family. And then in some cases, you also have differences within parties, within those populist radical right parties. So we have looked at those differences along a number of variables or factors that we determine important when evaluating and assessing the behavior of these parties. So you do have clear group of radical right parties who for long have been cultivated by Russia in numerous ways, from sending money to holding seminars and fora in Russia, to, of course, using trolls and Russian propaganda that would help these parties. And we have seen that in 2014, the invasion of Crimea did not harm the connections of those parties as much with Russia as now the war is doing. So with the event of the war, we see that many of those parties started steering away from their linkages with Russia, rhetorically playing down their connections with Russia. On the one hand, We have these parties, Vox, the Chega, Marine Le Pen con il Rassemblement National, the Fratelli d'Italia, who shift away and downplay those connections. But you still have enough parties who did not do that, or quite the opposite, actually played up their support for Putin. You do have, for example, my native Bulgaria with Revival. You have Orban. You have the AfD. You have the Lega in Italy. You have the PVV in the Netherlands and the FVD. And the Freedom Party in Austria, who are not distancing as much themselves from Putin. Maybe they're shifting the rhetoric, but they remain pro-Russian. Then we looked at this NATO divide, which in many ways correlates with the position on Russia and Putin, but there's some interesting dynamics there as well. You do have some of those parties who are not arguing openly against NATO. Certainly there are those who also take a clear anti-NATO and pro-Putin position. There are those parties who remain pro-NATO, but who, like in Slovakia or in Austria, for example, argue for neutrality. So this should not become a NATO conflict. We should not get involved in this. And actually, the national interest is threatened if we take part in this conflict. We then see some intra-party division in some positions. So we have seen in the Bulgarian БСП, the socialists, who are not a populist radical right party, but who have been one of the staunchest supporters of Russian interests in the country. Or in the Romanian AUR party, you start hearing different voices. Even if the official party position may be this or that, there are factions within the party. Similarly in Portugal with the Chega. Another question that we looked at in terms of foreign and geostrategic orientation is the relations with the EU. And here again, we have a very interesting variety. From, of course, aligning with the EU, many of those parties aligned with the sanctions and the condemnation, let's say, of the referenda on Donetsk and Luhansk, but nevertheless use this opportunity to criticize the EU in every possible way. So from one extreme was criticizing the EU for taking any action and ignoring domestic issues. At the other extreme, we have criticizing the EU in Estonia and Lithuania, for example, for not doing enough and not doing it fast enough. So again, you have this variety of positions, and mixed with that is also the ever-present critique of radical right populist parties of yielding national sovereignty to a supranational body that is inefficient and actually suffers from democratic deficit because decisions there are not done in consultation with the people. We then looked at the response of radical right parties, again, a very wide variety, from the condemnation of Putin, which could take the form of this normalization thesis and mainstreaming hypothesis that those parties, such as Marine Le Pen, for example, try to get closer to the middle voter and to come across as less radical, to outright pro-Russian attitudes and maybe ignoring these issues altogether, such as Berlusconi in Italy, for example, or in Slovakia, where you have highlighting of other issues. So again, a wide spectrum. We also see something very interesting, that you have some taming down of nativism when it comes to immigration, still utilizing the typical radical right rhetoric against refugees, but declaring, at least initially, Ukrainian refugees to be real refugees, to be good refugees. So because they're not escaping economic hardship, they're escaping a war. Also, they're nice-looking refugees. And several parties in many countries have argued that because of their cultural proximity, because of the fact that they're neighboring countries, such as in Finland, for example, this argument, they're okay, which of course is a purely racist argument and goes along with the innate xenophobia of those parties. What is interesting that they managed to do this toning down of nationalism while also returning to the argument of national sovereignty, which I find fascinating because, again, these parties are not primarily programmatic, they're primarily polarizing. And they managed to bring together issues that make no sense when put together, but they do it successfully because, again, they appeal emotionally, they appeal to frustrations. So the return to national sovereignty is fascinating the way it was used in Croatia, for example, and the parallels that were drawn between the homeland war of the 90s and the heroism of the Ukrainian soldiers falling in the war. So on the one hand, you have playing national pride and saying, see, the Ukrainians are fighting just like we had to fight. See, they have the same pride like we do. On the other hand, you may have this return to national sovereignty becoming a reason to advocate for greater defense spending, or for banning Russian language instruction in the Baltic countries and emphasizing actually this anti-Russian discourse for the local ethnically Russian population, to advocating for neutrality because, again, this would only escalate the context. Parallel with that, we do have turning to domestic socio-economic issues. Especially as the war drags on, these issues, of course, become ever more salient because economic difficulties continue to grow, inflation is hard. So you have, again, a wide palette of responses from, sanctions are ineffective because they hurt European and domestic audiences more, to by helping Ukraine, you're depriving your domestic constituencies from much-needed resources. So again, a variety of factors. It's interesting the way mainstream parties have acted to counter those strategies. In many cases, we have seen a red line and a strategy of isolationism, sort of ignore them and treat them as marginal. But we have seen that in some cases, those parties have been managed to move the entire debate to the right, or to move the entire debate. Bulgaria is a good example. At first, you couldn't talk about military aid. It had to be only humanitarian aid. Lithuania is another example where, again, Russian language became a stigma, even though those are Lithuanian citizens living in the country. Next, we looked at also external factors and internal factors, which are very important. From historical, cultural affinities, which are very different, even if you look at a period like Eastern Europe. So if you take a Romania, or if you take a Poland, and if you take a Bulgaria or a Serbia, the relationship with Russia varies dramatically. So the fact that you're talking about post-communist countries means very different things in terms of attitudes in the conflict. Economic relations have been another big factor. So Italy, for example, is a country where this monetary aspect of relations with Russia has been very important. And there have been a lot of arguments that Italy needs to look out for itself and therefore orient itself towards China and Russia. Italy was the only country to sign the Belt and Road Initiative. So there was a lot of pressure for developing these bilateral relations as opposed to relations within the EU level. And let's not forget the gas and the energy dependency. And I think if we look at the consequences of the war, one of the most positive aspects, and His Excellency mentioned already the fact that Europe is united, the fact that democratic values have been strengthened as very important positive aspects of a really tragic event in war. The EU has gone from 51.3% of energy dependency on Russia in 2019 to, as of September of last year, 12.9. So any myths that we need Russian energy, that our economies depend on that, have been completely busted. Any arguments that we could not move to diversified sources or to greener economy have been discredited completely. So I would argue that Putin has helped Europe really do something that Europe was not able to do on its own for 20 years, arguing here in this very parliament about green energy. With voters, what we see is also interesting. On the one hand, we have a lot of wins. These parties have not disappeared, including in most recent elections since the war. But on the other hand, there isn't really an increase in the overall support for these parties. In some country, they may gain more, or some party may gain more at the expense of the other. But overall, these parties have remained marginal in many, many places, of course, with exceptions such as Hungary, Serbia, or Turkey, where you do see these very strong authoritarian tendencies, which we argue are a little bit of a different phenomenon. So what we notice is that we do have great diversity and strategies that these parties have used, from mainstreaming to focusing on socioeconomic issues to national attitudes and priorities. But at the same time, this has not really changed the game dramatically. It has not really increased the overall influence of these parties, and any increased influence in particular countries that we see is also coupled with very strong mobilization in support of liberal and Euro-Atlantic values. So there is a lot to hope for. On the other hand, we have confirmed that these parties are very flexible. They're very chameleonic-like, they're very malleable. So countering their rhetoric is anything but simple. Because the moment that COVID rhetoric, which they exploited very successfully, is no longer relevant, they simply pass on to another issue and manage to polarize it. Today it is the war, tomorrow it would be inflation, the day after it would be migration. So it is a cancerous tumor that we need to always continue to fight, and we need to always remain vigilant against. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia and Gilles, for that presentation. I would now like to hand over to Mr. Radim Kanev, MEP, for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. A rather undeserved honor, I would say, but still, it's an honor for me. I would try to be brief by concluding, and I must admit it's a difficult task after all the prominent speakers we already heard. But I would start with a question that I had myself last night when reading part of the papers in this really wonderful project. And now I elaborate even a bit more on it. It is, do we have good news from this project, in fact? First of all, it's very difficult to talk of good news when we speak of Russian meddling in European politics and right-wing extremism in European politics. Because we must admit, at least right-wing extremism is not going anywhere. It is here to stay in our countries, in our political systems. As Emilia said, it's extremely adaptable to new situations. So it is difficult to speak of good news. The expectation that the start of the war in Ukraine and the changing of public opinion against the regime of Vladimir Putin, quite natural, will lead to the final decline of European right-wing was, to say the least, naive. Right-wing extremism exists many years before Putin. And this very fruitful cooperation they had doesn't mean it doesn't have its very solid social base and many, many reasons to exist in our political systems. On the other hand, right-wing parties are only one means by which Putin had his interference in European politics, and I would easily argue on some panel with more time for that, that it was by far not the most dangerous. That interference through mainstream parties and governmental institutions and main economy players is a big problem, and what we have to keep in mind is not to allow it again. Not to forget the lessons from 2022, because we see people already starting to forget, or at least wishing to forget. And this is a big danger. And yet I would say there is good news. First of all, there is one good news which is not very much into the report. And it is that there is a number of right-wing parties in Europe moving from the definition of radical extremist right into something that we might not like, but it's still very much into the political mainstream of Europe as we know it. For example, the biggest party in Sweden being such an example, and all these parties making this move, they very definitely, very clearly cut the ties to Russia, if they had some. Another example is that the biggest populist parties in the Nordic countries clearly abandoned their anti-NATO stance, very traditional in their political history, and now are arguing for the accession of NATO, thus building a national consensus around this goal for the Nordic countries, which I find extremely important for our security. Then a number of parties which clearly remain on the extremist side, as shown in your papers, are abandoning the pro-Russian narrative, more or less, to different degrees, but since, as said many times, they're notoriously opportunistic, this means that Putin is losing popular appeal in Europe. He's losing ground in the European public opinion. And this is something well reflected in Emilia's article on Bulgaria, but something that I, as a Bulgarian politician, can also easily say. Even in Bulgaria, with our notorious pro-Russian national feelings and historical ties, and with 10 times intensification of Russian propaganda, which was unbearable before this 10 times intensification, still the public opinion is changing quite favorably for European values, and certainly not in favor of Putin's regime and Russian imperialistic dreams generally. So there is a very clear movement in the European public opinion. It doesn't mean voters who don't like Putin anymore are now the biggest adherents of liberal democracy. No, they are not, and they will probably not be in the near future. But still, this very toxic marriage between right-wing extremism and Putin's regime is somehow dissolved, which is certainly a good news. And last not least, I would say that there is a moment of revealing and demarcation of the clear Russian assets in European politics. And this is positive. Let's know who is who. Because before, everything was quite well hidden under the popular appeal of Putin in Europe and all these conservative ideas, anti-liberalism and so on, but still it's not that we support an authoritarian or in fact totalitarian regime, but more that we are opposing the liberal discourse in Europe. Now we see that yes, there is authentic conservatism in Europe, not accepting liberal democratic values as they are in the 21st century, but on the other side they are pretty clear Russian assets. And they have their cards on the table much more than 1 year ago, which I think is a very good news, not only for my country, but for many, many others. And here we maybe must assess, just as final remark, because there is this notable exception from many things that we see in this report, Orban's Hungary. It's yet another moment to assess, in my point of view, whether we shouldn't say much more plainly that Orban's Hungary, as governed at the moment, does not very much belong to the European family. It's a very big problem, very big question, very big issue, but by not talking of it, we don't resolve it for sure.
Thank you very much, Radan, for taking us out on a positive note. That's fantastic to have some good news. Some more good news. We have time for Q&A and discussion. So I think we should proceed as follows. We're happy to take questions, and we'll take them in order. So if you have a question, I'll ask you to put your hand up for selection. Remember to turn your microphone on, address your question to the speaker, and then turn your microphone off, please. So the lady over here.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conference. My name is Stella Verichi. I have studied physics and informatics. I am a member of the European Physical Society. And I have one question concerning the far left and far right parties, European parties, they are pro-Putin. You never mentioned that the most of chefs of this party receive money direct from Putin. Le Pen, Schröder, AfD chefs receive personally money. Why these people are not taken to the justice? I give you an example. Sarkozy take the money from the dictator Gaddafi. He has a process in France. Why the others don't have this process? My other question is concerning coalition, an army coalition to help Ukraine to win this war. And when is obliged in a case of war crime and homicide to have a declaration, to have a coalition to intervene in Ukraine. You say me, okay, but Russia will make a veto. Yes, but it is the possibility, a procedure to put Russia away from this vote temporarily and to have this directive from UN. And in this case, NATO has the capability to help Ukrainian army, not with military people direct in Ukraine, but from EU countries in Ukraine.
One thing I didn't mention, thank you so much for your questions, is that, of course, we also have a section that talks about non-radical right parties and left parties who are very pro-Putin. So this is touched upon in the report, and we do have more than one actor like this. We do have the Cinque Stelle in Italy, the Portuguese Communist Party, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, Die Linke, and so forth. And also, thank you so much for pointing out to the personal connections. You do have, in addition to Orban, Berlusconi, and Marine Le Pen, you do have also these bilateral relations that are developing. And here I absolutely have to agree with Radan that the biggest problem indeed is not those parties, because you have a lot much deeper, especially economic interests and links within that.
Maybe just one thing about receiving money from Russia. It's true, but there are different ways. For instance, Marine Le Pen, she didn't get, as far as we know, she didn't get personal money. Her party got a loan from a bank that was backed by Russia, which is slightly different and which is unfortunately legal.
Can I ask you as well to keep your questions to one so we can have as many as possible? Professor Öztürk.
Many thanks for the wonderful project. My question might go to Dr. Emilia, or anybody else might be interested. So as you know, there are both demand and supply factors in the rise of populism in Europe. Definitely one of those determining factors is immigration, of course. And one recent wave of immigration came from Ukraine because of Putin's invasion of the country. And all those far-right populists are observing that one. They are against immigrants, But such a populist government, such a populist leader in Russia caused a very prominent wave of new immigration. So my expectation is that those populist governments should understand, should re-evaluate their values, their position that populism is one of the determinants of the immigration that they are rejecting indeed. What you have seen in your report, are they in a position to re-evaluate their position, criticize their own position for that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Indeed, there's a couple of dynamics. So initially, many such parties embraced Ukrainian refugees. But there's also the question of duration. So very few people could argue that at first that you have to help the Ukrainian mothers in Poland who were arriving and in the local population that was leaving, for example, pushchairs and strollers. But a year later, it's much easier to return to anti-immigration arguments. I know in my native Bulgaria, there has been a big backlash after a few months because the realization came that Ukrainians actually have high standards of living. And that when those people were coming, they did not look impoverished. They were running from a war, but they were driving nice cars, they had nice clothes, and this, of course, caused a lot of jealousy. So I think this is why it is very important for us to stand together in a united front and have a response, because the longer that this war drags, the easier it would be to argue about those domestic issues, to argue about those immigration issues. And you have seen, even though public opinion dramatically shifted in favor of Ukraine, maybe for the first 6 months of the war, the situation now is different. Yes, now commemorations of the war last week refreshed all of those memories, but the longer the war goes, the more likely we are to see a return to many of those anti-immigration and overall xenophobic arguments.
I believe we have a question or a comment from Petras.
Well, having this possibility, I can't abstain from asking you a question. I mean, did you notice any cooperation and impact, at least impact, from American populism, right-wing populism, which was, with Trump, quite a phenomena, on European side of populist army? And if you noticed, was any change after departure of Trump? Did it make any influence in this regard? And finally, how you would assess the cooperation of those right-wing, let's say, populistic countries in Europe? You see any increase in efficiency in their cooperation in, let's say, sending a certain more common narrative or whatever, or it's really more nationally based? Thank you.
Well, maybe on the cooperation between those parties, as we all know, they are split into two different groups within the European Parliament now. Maybe we should think ahead of what may happen in the 2024 elections. As we all know, links with Russia was one of the main issues why those parties couldn't get together in the European Parliament. Now that many of those parties, including the Lega in Italy, the Rassemblement National and others, have had to drop those links, maybe we should wonder whether this would help them get together into one unified group. Because again, I know for the Polish populists, for instance, the Russian thing was one key issue. So there's no prediction there, there's no, I don't know, but I think the fact that they were forced to change their positions on Russia might create new opportunities for cooperation that were not there before. So we should be careful and we should monitor that in the 2024 elections, definitely.
And thank you for bringing this very important question of America, which has been, of course, one of the biggest supporters in every way of Ukraine. It's a counterfactual, but I would argue that if this war had happened with Trump being a president, the response would have been very different. Yes. Even though the Republican Party is traditionally hawkish and it has been all too quick to jump into international conflicts and sort of export conflicts outside and support military industry and so forth, the industrial military complex. In that case, because of Trump being such an outlier, and really only adopted the Republican Party as a platform for his personal political rise, the Republican Party has to reconcile with a leader who was not in line with many long-standing positions of the party. So currently the party is in a huge crisis as we approach primaries because they need to reinvent themselves. They need to take a position on Trump. They need to vote in primaries and see whether Trump would win those primaries. And if he does, if they're truthful to their internal procedures, they have to stand behind Trump again. Now, the chances of that seem less and less, and he has been losing support. But also, we see now that a lot of criticism goes to Biden for not paying enough attention to domestic issues. So again, populism plays in a similar way there. And of course, there's referrals to his family ties with Ukraine and all of that he has a personal stake. The positive news is, of course, we had an administration who took decisive action and managed to pass through Congress and continues to pass through Congress one financial package after another. But none of this is guaranteed with the primaries and the elections that are coming up.
Influence on the European populists?
Thank you, yes. And for the influence on the European populists, I would say that it has, to some extent, decreased. Trump was a huge figure,
Magnetic.
large, right? And he emanated admiration, just like Putin, though it was easier to admire Trump because, again, he was elected not by changing the electoral laws of the country and so forth, what Putin, of course, did more than once. So he was even a safer choice. But quoting him allowed those parties to have a pro-Euro-Atlantic position while also speaking to domestic frustrations. And I would say with the departure of Trump and the war, this influence has actually weakened. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Gentleman in the front here.
My name is Selçuk Gültaş. I am from ECPS. I want to ask Ambassador Chenso, Mr. Ambassador, you talk about the European Parliament reaction to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but how do you assess the European Union, in particular the Council, reaction to the war? Do you see any more rooms that EU can play? Secondly, how do you assess European Union reaction to the rise of right-wing populism supported by Putin of Russia? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the second?
The second is, how do you assess the European Union reaction to the rise of right-wing populism supported by Putin of Russia? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Whether there is a room for improvement or maneuver, well, definitely the situation is not static. The positive thing is, as I try to say, that there is a unity. There are outstanding issues, and it's natural that member states, they have differences in their position. And when we are talking about the sanctions pressure or joint procurement of weapons for Ukraine, some of member states have also limitations regarding their own participation in the common defense and security policy of the EU, and it has relevant implications with regard to situation in Ukraine. But what is important that the member state, the Council, and it was very clear in the situation with the macro-financial assistance. They're able to overcome those differences, and they're able to get out of the difficult situation, and they do not allow individual member states to get the whole union as a hostage, right? So I think there is a positive development here. Definitely, there is a huge pressure, on economic pressure and political pressure on the member states, on the Union, and Putin regime, they have this, as far as we see, they benefit from the miserable situation of the Russian population. The life in Russia is miserable. It's difficult to get lawyer. The price of life in Russia is zero. So the Russian regime considers those elements as their strengths. So in the very short run, yes, the strong feature of the Russian regime. In the long run, they're getting, they're going to hit the wall because it's a path to self-destruction. But in the EU is much more vulnerable in that regard. And that's why EU need to address those issues of the energy supply, or inflation, or migration. So yes, there are difficulties, but we see that Russia, both Russia and also forces inside Union, they failed to convert, those outstanding issues into the real problematic issues and to create a crisis in the EU because of the Russian war against Ukraine. So, yes, we need weapon, as I already repeated a few times, and there is progress, and we expect smart solutions, both on short, medium, and long-term tracks. And now discussion is going on in Stockholm. It will continue in a week in Brussels, and hopefully on the foreign ministers level, and hopefully will be the solution will be endorsed. This complex solution on the council level, on the highest level. The issues of Russian leadership responsibility and the setting up the tribunal. To special tribunal on Russian aggression or confiscation of Russian assets. They are both. Those issues are very difficult for because of the legal elements, but also political elements. But we also see here positive dynamics, more understanding among member states that we need to get there, and Russia has to pay in all senses, right? To bring to responsibility the leadership, to prevent those cases in the future. And it's relevant not only to Russia, but other regimes. And we are discussing now that those regimes, they also, the stakes are high. If Putin wins, they will win, and vice versa. But also financially, EU is taking a huge burden now, supporting Ukraine, but at the end, Russia must pay. And there are solutions, food for oil, like in Iraq 20 years ago, other solutions. So we need to understand finally that Russia is a rock state, and the attitude should be relevant to this country. Thank you. And regarding populists, yes, it's one of the issues which has been neglected here, and including Russian populism. And Russia was regarded as just an irritant, as a spoiler. But now we all understand what is at stake and how big is the danger. And hopefully there will be more adequate attention to those issues, not only in Russia, but also in Europe. Thank you.
Young researcher at the back.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very important report and a great discussion today. So just a question for everybody, really. I wonder what the lessons are, really, of the timing that it took to take Russia this seriously in terms of it took this long. Because I can remember very vividly, a few years ago in the United Kingdom when we had 2 British nationals poisoned on the streets of Salisbury by Russian actors. And that was an extremely significant event, which I think should have, Crimea before that, of course, but the escalation in Russian aggression was there to see. And I just wonder what the lessons are in terms of preventing this in the future, because speaking from a UK perspective, our governing party, the Conservative Party, has huge amounts of funding that come from Russia. Our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson appointed a Russian oligarch or an associated Russian oligarch to the House of Lords, and these things were not taken seriously at the time, even suppressing a report into Russian influence around the time of the 2019 general election in the UK as well. So in terms of looking forward to other threats similar to those posed by Russia and the influence that those sorts of actors have in Western and in European countries, what are the lessons that can be learned in terms of preventing those things coming to fruition in the future? Thank you.
Here was me thinking we could have a day without Boris. Who would like to pick that up?
Of course, it's a question without a clear answer. But the truth is in the very question. What has to be done in order not to repeat history? Certainly there is no recipe, but what I already mentioned in my previous intervention, I will reiterate now. Most important thing is to not consider the end of military activities as return to normal. Because one way or another we hope all, of course, for the one way, not for the another. But hostilities will cease or hopefully end. And it might not be in the near future, but it will happen. A lot of people are thinking for this moment as for the moment that everything in trade and cooperation with Russia will start anew. That's why they hope it will be sooner than later. We all hope it will be sooner than later because of the cost of human life and the fate of Ukrainian people, but not because it will just start all over again. Most importantly, we need to keep in mind that economic isolation of Russia must go on. And in my opinion, even the political role of Vladimir Putin is not the decisive factor. Because if Russia loses the war, Putin might easily lose his position as the supreme leader of the empire. But it doesn't mean by any means that this is the end of totalitarian regime which now is in place in Russia, or the end of imperialistic ambition.
May I follow? It's a good point. And, well, definitely on defense side, I mean, we have to invest, we have to produce, and probably we have to invent much more, because it's a standing threat. It's a standing threat. But on the soft side of this phenomena, I think we have to implement to full extent Magnitsky Human Rights Act. We have to take corruption very, very seriously. And I mean, that example you mentioned with the House of Lords or whomever, I'm very happy that London becomes much cleaner, maybe emptier a bit. I mean, losing some money in a real estate market. But, with the war against Ukraine, I think the point will come when Russians will wake up and ask, where is our money? And then that money invested, placed, kept in Zurich, maybe Berlin, maybe Paris, who knows, Nice, definitely, some. I mean, those places will be visited by new Russian society, new government. So that's why, I mean, to prevent us from making more mistakes and letting that dirty money, which is very dangerous, being infiltrated into our societies, our economies, we have to be very serious. And now, I mean, to begin a search, appoint serious prosecutors, and go in systematic way, and for long time. And probably Ukraine might receive quite a boost for this reconstruction fund once those money will be found and channeled to the right place. But to my understanding, really fight against corruption, not just to teach third countries to fight against corruption, but us to take it seriously. Thank you.
We have time, I think, for a couple more questions. Young man, right at the back.
Yes, thanks a lot, first of all, for this amazing report. I think you have done a fantastic job. My question would be, did you have time to assess how the Russian invasion of Ukraine impact the political party system of countries in Europe where there isn't any right-wing populist party at the time? I'm thinking namely about the Republic of Ireland, where there isn't properly right-wing populism party. My question would be, did it lead to the rise of anti-war sentiment on the far right of the political spectrum, radicalization of centre-right party? Did it fuel anti-war sentiment of, let's say, left-wing radical populism, or could it lead to the creation of establishment of any other right-wing party in the future? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. No, we didn't. Actually, we very much focused on those countries where there were well-established right-wing populist parties. What we did on the other end was, in some countries where it was relevant, we asked the authors to look at other populist parties, especially populists of the left, to see, because these parties have been pro-Russian as well for different reasons, and they've been pursuing a different agenda, but it was interesting to see how those parties had reacted to the war. Again, the sort of strategy they had used to navigate the war. But no, you're right, it was we started with this very well-defined focus on countries where the populist radical right was successful.
I think we have time for probably one more. The gentleman at the front.
Okay, my question will go to Dr. Rivaldi. So thank you for this report. I just read some of the parts and maybe I missed. It gives a good outlook about the political parties, the far right or radical right-wing populist parties. But what about the social dimensions, the networks like Génération Identitaire in France, for example? These are very nativist, very coupled, they have a strong lines with these parties as well. This one thing, do they also cut their lines with Russia? This one thing. And second thing, in line with this, let's say these networks, for example, there are foreign fighters now in Ukraine, which is started in 2014. They supported Russia specifically, and now they in war, and they help Russia to invade Ukraine, for example. What about these ones? Do you have anything about the impact nowadays? Thank you.
Thank you. No, again, we very much concentrated on established political parties. We didn't look at extreme right groups, which are around those parties in many countries. And no, we definitely didn't look at the sort of networks you're referring to. Again, we had to limit ourselves to something more narrow. Otherwise, I think that the report would have been definitely too big. And we really wanted to have this report out as soon as possible because we thought it was a very timely analysis, and therefore the choice, which we might criticize, but the choice to have maybe a narrow focus. Thank you.
All right, we definitely have time for one more. So, Madam, I think you want to have another shot, please.
Yes, I have a question concerning Magnitsky law. I am one of the first here in European Parliament. I speak about it 1 year before COVID epidemic. I know that the Renew group it's really supports this I find very quick, very efficacious, and you cannot go away from this sanction. You can go in other, but Magnitsky law, it's nominal and it's finished. So my question is, how is the stadium now with this Magnitsky law on the EU level? Do you make some votes? Do you have some new group reunion concerning this law?
Thank you for your important support on this matter. You know, last autumn, von der Leyen made a very strong commitment to add to the existing European kind of instrument on human rights with the inclusion of corruption. She made it, I mean, she made a speech in front of the whole House. So since then, I heard nothing yet, but I mean, we follow. And I know that 1 year remains, only 1 year remains for this parliament. So we will try, I mean, to push as much as possible in order to have something tangible by the midst of this year. Otherwise, we might again be too late to receive this good news.
All right. Well, sadly, we need to draw the event here in this room to a close. Happily, however, we can take the conversation to our reception, which will start shortly outside. So you're all welcome to continue the discussion there. I would like to take this opportunity to thank His Excellency for attending today. To our hosts from the European Parliament, thank you very much for your invitation. I would like as well, Emilia had to run, she had a flight, but I would like to thank Gilles and Emilia for their incredible work bringing this report together, and our report writers, our 30 report writers. And finally, I would like to thank in the ECPS our wonderful interns, Ivan, Margot, Anita, Kim, Saliha, and Martin. And a special thanks, please join me to thank Azize Sargin for her incredible work bringing the report together. Thank you, Azize. And with that, thank you for your attendance today, for the great questions. Thank you very much.